They survived the plague, but no one could explain why their shadows disappeared. This isn't folklore. It's not a creepypasta. This is a true story, buried in the forgotten pages of haunted history, pulled from medical reports that were sealed and church records that were burned. In the summer of 1878, a mysterious illness swept through a quiet Kansas township, killing 47 people in under a month. Yet somehow, the four Blackwood brothers walked through it untouched. Not a fever, not a cough, not a single symptom. At first, they were called chosen, then cursed. Eyewitnesses claimed that by winter, they no longer cast shadows in sunlight. Others whispered they spoke in voices layered with echoes, as if something ancient answered when they opened their mouths. This is a forbidden archive, a vanished case file, a chapter history tried to erase. But when you follow the trail of scorched Bibles and erased names, what you find isn't just terrifying, it forces you to ask whether they survived the disease or became something worse. The summer of 1878 began with dust, drought, and a death that didn't make sense. Sarah Hartman, the town's only shopkeeper, was laughing with customers one morning and dead by dawn the next, her skin unnaturally tight, eyes wide open, as if she'd seen something she couldn't comprehend. Within days, bodies began to fall like clockwork, young, old, healthy. It didn't matter. By the third week, Cedar Ridge had lost nearly 1/6 of its population, and panic turned the quiet Kansas town into something feral. Families locked themselves in barns. Church bells rang for funerals no one attended. But while fear spread like fire through the community, one place remained untouched: the Blackwood homestead, 5 miles east, surrounded by scorched wheat and silence. No one there coughed. No one there died. And no one, not even the preacher, could explain how they seemed immune to death itself. But that wasn't the part that haunted people. The part they whispered about was what stopped showing up beneath their feet. She died with her eyes open, and they say she was smiling. That was the first thing people remembered about Sarah Hartman, the 62-year-old shopkeeper whose sudden death in July of 1878 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most unexplainable medical collapses in American history. Cedar Ridge was a small, sunburnt township in the Kansas plains of barely 300 residents, most of them farmers, God-fearing, predictable. Nothing about this place should have attracted attention. And yet within 24 hours of Sarah's death, 3 more followed. No one could make sense of it. These weren't people who had been sick. They had been laughing at breakfast, dead by nightfall. Their skin turned pale and tight like wax, but their eyes refused to close. Some said it looked like they'd seen something. Others whispered it looked like they'd heard something. Doctors from Topeka were called in. Notes were written, then later torn out. By the 10th day, 19 had died. But there was no smell of rot, no fever, no signs of struggle. Just a quiet kind of stillness that crept under doorways and settled in people's bones. The town was unravelling, and something, or someone, was watching. The only question was, why hadn't it touched the Blackwoods? When 3 doctors refused to sign a death certificate, you know something is deeply wrong. That's exactly what happened in Cedar Ridge. As the body count rose, the official reports stopped. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, Dr. Calvin Jones, and even the county's chief medical examiner all refused to file final documentation. Not because they didn't see the bodies. They did. But because something about the way these people died didn't fit medical logic. Their organs were intact. There was no sign of infection, no internal damage, no external trauma. It was as if their bodies simply stopped. And just like that, the paperwork vanished. The Kansas Department of Health issued a temporary quarantine order. But by then, it was too late. What's more disturbing is what came next. The local Methodist church burned the baptism records, not by accident, not in a fire. They lit them deliberately, page by page, starting with every name connected to the Blackwood family. When questioned, the Reverend simply said, "Some things are better forgotten." That line would haunt the town for generations. Because when a church tries to erase the names of the living, not the dead, you begin to wonder whether the real contagion wasn't illness, but knowledge. And behind those missing records was a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. Not even God. It wasn't their silence that scared people. It was the way their shadows stopped showing up. Long after the last coffin was buried and the ground stopped swallowing names, rumours about the Blackwood brothers only grew darker. Josiah, Elias, Matthew, and Jonah, 4 siblings who lived miles outside Cedar Ridge on a burned stretch of prairie no one dared cross after dusk. They didn't grieve. They didn't speak. And strangest of all, they never attended a single funeral, even though they'd grown up with the very people being buried. At first, folks chalked it up to fear, or shock, or God's will, but then came the sightings. People claimed that when the brothers walked past lamplit windows, no shadows followed them. That in broad daylight, their outlines flickered unnaturally, as if the sun didn't recognize them anymore. Farm dogs howled when they passed. Infants screamed. One farmer swore he saw Jonah standing motionless in the wheat field at 2A. Eyes open, arms at his sides, barefoot in the frost, and when he blinked, Jonah was gone. The town called them survivors. But others whispered a darker word exchanged. As if what came back from that farmhouse wasn't entirely human, and the real Blackwood boys had never left the plague house alive. No one remembers inviting them, but somehow they always appeared at the edge of the crowd. When Cedar Ridge gathered for town meetings, sermons, or public burials, the Blackwood brothers would be there standing far back, just beyond the lantern light, unmoving, unreadable. People said they never blinked, never whispered, never crossed themselves. It was as if they were watching something none of the others could see, and yet no one dared tell them to leave. Even the sheriff looked away. As weeks passed and the death toll faded into a strange stillness, something colder settled over the town, not fear of sickness, but fear of being seen. Because whatever had passed over Cedar Ridge may have spared the Blackwoods, but it hadn't left empty-handed. And then, one night, the letters began to arrive. It arrived with no stamp, no sender, and no explanation, just 6 words scribbled in shaking ink. They are not what you think. That's how it began for Reverend Caldwell, the town's minister, and one of the few people left unafraid to mention the Blackwoods by name. The envelope had been slipped under his chapel door sometime after midnight, and though no one saw who delivered it, the footprints leading away were barefoot and steaming in the morning frost. Inside, The note was wrapped around a page torn from the old church registry, one that had supposedly been burned weeks earlier when the parish purged the names of the cursed. The Blackwoods' names were still visible, but beside each one was something disturbing, a second name, written in Latin, scratched in like an annotation or correction. Caldwell didn't sleep that night, and by dawn he had vanished. No horse was taken, no note was left, just a bed made tight and a lantern still burning. It was the first confirmed disappearance after the plague, and it wouldn't be the last, because that letter wasn't the only one. Over the next 6 days, 5 more envelopes appeared across Cedar Ridge, each with a different warning, and one chilling phrase repeated: they were claimed, not cured. The handwriting matched no one in town, but the paper came from the chapel's own pulpit. Sheriff Emmett Rourke didn't believe in curses. He believed in patterns. And what he saw after the letters arrived was a pattern no logic could explain. The parchment, aged, yellowed, and stained with wax, had been part of the church's sermon book just days earlier. But now it carried phrases no priest would ever write. They walk beneath borrowed skin. The wheat bowed before them. The silence feeds. Emmett collected the letters in a locked drawer. He questioned townsfolk. He rode out to the Blackwood property alone, but returned pale and visibly shaken, refusing to speak of what he saw. His deputy found him later that week in the station attic, sitting perfectly still, surrounded by pages he'd copied from the original letters, all rewritten by hand, over and over, in charcoal. Every version ended the same way: you must not answer when they knock. That night, the bell atop the chapel tower rang once. Just once. No wind, no hands. And when they searched the bell chamber the next morning, all they found was a circle of salt, a single bloody fingerprint, and an iron key, twisted in half. The letters stopped coming, but something else started showing up. At first, it was just markings. Symbols carved into barn doors, scorched into the earth outside windows, scratched onto the glass from the inside. Always the same crude geometry, concentric circles crossed by diagonal lines, like eyes with no pupils. The markings appeared overnight, in homes where the letters had been delivered. The town's blacksmith tried burning one off a stable wall, and his house collapsed the next morning with his family still inside. No fire, no wind, just structural failure that no engineer could explain. Then came the voices. Whispers outside windows with no one there. Children waking up screaming that the boys with no sound had been watching them sleep. The Blackwood brothers never came into town again, but people claimed to see them standing along the fences at night, always at a distance, always silent. And then every clock in Cedar Ridge stopped at 3:33 a.m. Not once, not twice, but every single night, for 6 nights. That was when the town's historian, Mrs. Lillian Tate, uncovered something buried deep in a 30-year-old journal entry written by the Blackwood family's great-grandfather. When they return, they must be fed, or they will choose for themselves. It wasn't just the people who vanished, it was the rules, the sky, the sense that time even moved forward. As Cedar Ridge slipped further into stillness, logic unravelled. The wheat stopped growing. The moon rose late. Dogs refused to bark. Something was building something older than disease, colder than death. And then the graves began to open, When the first grave split open, they blamed the rain by the fifth. They stopped talking altogether. What terrified the people of Cedar Ridge wasn't that the coffins were disturbed. It was that the wood was intact from the outside, yet empty inside. The dead hadn't been dug up. They had walked out. And there were no footprints, no mud, no signs of struggle. Just coffins, clean and hollow, as if the bodies had never existed. Families began sleeping in shifts, posting watchmen at the edges of their property. But the watchmen began disappearing too. 3 in one night, the town's remaining priest was found in the chapel basement, whispering into a hole in the dirt floor, repeating one sentence over and over. They're taking the ones who remember. The townsfolk stopped asking questions. Mail service halted. Children were no longer allowed outside. Windows were boarded. The schoolhouse bell cracked straight through the middle, without ever being touched. And worst of all, the Blackwood property, once surrounded by dying grass, was now covered in perfect, waist-high wheat, lush, golden, swaying without wind. The town was starving. The Blackwoods were thriving, and no one dared to ask why. By the time they lit the town hall on fire, it wasn't to destroy evidence, it was to erase memory. That's what Clara Millstone, the oldest living resident of Cedar Ridge, whispered before she vanished from her nursing home bed without triggering a single hallway camera. The town had begun to turn on itself. Neighbours accused one another of hiding letters, of harbouring knowledge that drew the Blackwoods closer. One man, Henry Caldwell's cousin, was dragged from his home after claiming he'd been inside the farmhouse. He never finished his sentence. He just kept muttering. They remember what we forgot. They remember being left. What followed was a wave of silent terror. Radios stopped working, wells filled with blood-coloured algae. A newborn cried without a sound, mouth open, lungs empty. The sheriff locked himself in the jail, writing in tongues no one could translate. And then came the scarecrows. At first, they looked like any other bundle of straw, but they were placed outside every house that received a letter. Their arms hung wrong, their heads tilted east, and at exactly 3:33 a.m, they turned to face the front door, all at once. The town didn't die. All at once it unravelled, thread by thread, like a curse remembering how to breathe. Power lines snapped without wind, mirrors fogged from the inside. People forgot names they'd known for decades, including their own. And then came the fog. It wasn't thick, it wasn't grey, it was pale gold, and it smelled like wheat. It rolled in low, hugging the ground, and with it came the whispers, not loud, not angry, just persistent, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Do you remember what was promised? Why did you leave us here? Would you trade your voice to see them again? One by one. The last children in Cedar Ridge began answering out loud, and once they did, their voices never returned. They just stared, wide-eyed, silent, as if something else had taken root behind their gaze. A young boy wrote in charcoal on his parents' wall, "The Blackwoods aren't coming for us. They're waiting." That same night, every scarecrow disappeared. Every single one. And in their place, standing in perfect stillness, were 13 barefoot figures, each with empty eyes and mouths sewn shut, facing the town. What they found beneath the Blackwood farmhouse rewrote everything Cedar Ridge thought it knew about its past. It wasn't a basement. It was a chamber circular, ancient, and carved from bedrock older than any foundation in the county. No tools could have made those markings. No language matched the symbols. And at the centre, untouched by dust, sat a child's wooden chair, facing the wall, still warm. It wasn't a ritual site, it was a nursery. That's what the first historian muttered before tearing out her own eyes. The chamber beneath the Blackwood farmhouse wasn't just ancient, it was alive. The walls pulsed faintly, almost like breath beneath stone, and embedded within them were hundreds of tiny handprints, not etched, not painted, but pressed into the rock from the inside out. The chair in the centre, it was carved from bones, child-sized, and behind it, a single line burned into the stone in a language no one should have known, but everyone understood. We waited. You forgot. We remember. Blood samples taken from the walls matched no known species, yet contained partial DNA from over 24 missing townspeople. And then came the humming, soft, low, vibrating through teeth and bone, heard even when ears were covered. That's when the lights went out. Not just in the chamber, not just in Cedar Ridge, but across 3 counties. When power returned 8 minutes later, every photograph in town had changed. Faces blurred, eyes missing, and in the background of each stood 13 figures, watching, closer than before. The Blackwoods didn't bring the horror, they were born to contain it. That revelation shattered everything the townsfolk believed. Generations of silence weren't out of pride or secrecy, but sacrifice. The 13 figures. They matched portraits of the original Blackwood children supposedly buried in 1823 during the coughing winter. But their graves had always been sealed with iron rings. And now, every single one was empty. County records showed that every 33 years, Cedar Ridge experienced a population dip, where people left without explanation, except they didn't leave. Their names simply vanished from census logs, mailboxes, even headstones. Survivors claimed they never existed at all. The town wasn't cursed, it was a cage. A living offering to something beneath, something older than memory and hungry for recognition. And the letters, they weren't warnings. They were invitations. Each envelope delivered not to victims, but to witnesses, people who carried fragments of truth in their bloodlines, people whose silence fed the pact. The town's only librarian found the final clue, an 1817 newspaper ad reading, "Caretakers wanted. Must be willing to forget. No return expected." It wasn't about the missing. It was about what they took with them. When investigators cross-referenced the 13 original Blackwood children with present-day DNA databases, they discovered something horrifying. No known descendants. Not a single genetic line had continued. Every family that had once lived near the Blackwood property had died out, disappeared, or most disturbingly, left behind children who never aged past 11. School records were manipulated, birth certificates altered, and local physicians paid off to falsify reports. One surviving teacher confessed that every decade, a new set of students appeared same names, same faces, same handwriting. She had taught Amelia Rosewood 3 different times over 20 years. And each child was identical. Local timekeeping records showed unnatural anomalies, moon cycles repeating, shadows elongating, sunsets occurring hours late. The town was caught in a loop, a ritualized pattern of forgetting and repeating, designed to keep the Blackwoods from fully returning. And now that the chamber had been opened, that pattern was broken. The last remaining evidence, a torn journal from 1923 with a final entry scrawled in blood. If you're reading this, do not say their names out loud. That's how they wake up. They were never ghosts. They were instructions. That's what the linguist said before vanishing from her locked motel room. The symbols on the chamber wall weren't religious or decorative. They were functional. A sequence. A code. When pieced together, they formed a calendar. One that didn't match any known system but ended violently on August 13th, 2024. The final sequence translated to a chilling phrase. The 13th will remember what the 12th forgot. That same week, residents began to speak in tongues during sleep, scribbling ancient sigils onto mirrors, window panes, and even their own skin. One woman wrote her name backward 427 times before walking into a frozen lake. And all of them, every single one, spoke the same word before losing consciousness. Awaken. A forensic analysis of the sound frequency in their voices revealed a subharmonic layer not detectable by the human ear, but fatal to birds, whose corpses began raining from the sky in perfect circles. These weren't hauntings. They were countdowns. And Cedar Ridge was not a victim. It was a lighthouse built to keep something in. But now, someone had turned it off. It wasn't a curse. It was a contract, and someone had finally broken it. Deep within the town's archived land deeds, a forgotten clause emerged, signed in 1791 by the original settlers of Cedar Ridge. The document, written in both English and a language no historian could decipher, outlined a chilling agreement in exchange for prosperity. 13 souls every 33 years would be offered, not killed, but erased. Their memories absorbed, their timelines collapsed into the soil itself. That's why crops thrived during droughts. Why Cedar Ridge was never hit by war, plague, or recession. It had been protected by omission. But the last cycle was missed. The 13th soul never vanished. And that soul had grown up, unknowingly carrying the weight of an unfulfilled promise. That person was the one who opened the chamber. That person was you, and as the final sigil etched itself onto your skin without ink, without pain, you remembered everything. The screaming that no one else hears, the shadows that remember your name, and the whispered voices counting backward every night you try to sleep. You weren't spared. You were saved for last. By the time they realized what Cedar Ridge truly was, the silence had already spread. It wasn't just a town, it was a failsafe, a memory trap, a ritual in motion. And now, every clock that stopped ticking, every mirror that refused to reflect, every whisper in a static radio wasn't a glitch. It was a signal that it had begun again. No one leaves Cedar Ridge. Not really. That's what the man at the edge of town muttered, eyes glazed, fingers trembling, as he handed over a rusted compass that spun endlessly. Since the chamber was opened, every attempt to document the town's history has either disappeared, corrupted, or rewritten itself. Newspapers from the 1800s now contain names of people still alive. Birth records loop back on themselves, and videos uploaded about the events vanished within minutes. leaving behind static and an error code E13. Travellers who stay too long complain of dreams not their own, memories of children they never had, funerals they never attended, languages they shouldn't understand. One woman woke up with a name tattooed on her wrist in a forgotten alphabet when translated. It read, "You're next." The town soil rejects new graves. Phones ring with no signal. And the birds, they no longer fly over Cedar Ridge. They fly around it. The story didn't end with discovery. It infected perception. And now, you're here, watching this. So ask yourself, have you started forgetting anything? Names, faces, places you were sure existed yesterday? Because that's how it begins. The real horror wasn't what they uncovered. It's what followed them home. After the chamber was breached, residents of Cedar Ridge reported shifts in reality too subtle to explain, yet too disturbing to ignore. Clocks reversed at midnight. Family photos featured unfamiliar faces smiling back. One man claims he heard his daughter crying from inside the walls 10 years after she died. Another swears he passed himself on the road out of town, same clothes, same truck, just smiling. But the scariest part, his phone showed 2 identical GPS locations, one in Cedar Ridge, one at his own home. Every mirror reflects a second too late. Every whisper from a radio speaks a truth you don't remember living. People started locking doors that don't exist, drawing symbols in salt on hardwood floors, sleeping with their eyes open. A teacher tried burning her diary after reading entries. She never wrote entries predicting her husband's death 3 days before it happened. And it did. The town no longer traps people physically. It rewrites them silently, slowly, completely. And once it starts, there's no going back to the version of you that never stepped near this place. Not everyone who left Cedar Ridge came back the same. Some never really left at all. Months after the breach, strange behavioural shifts surfaced across state lines. People vanishing mid-conversation. Children drawing symbols they'd never seen. And entire families reporting the same exact nightmare on the same night. A door that opens inward, but never outward. Psychologists called it collective hysteria. Paranormal investigators called it a soft haunting. But those who'd been there knew better. One journalist who visited the ruins in secret returned with no footage, no audio, and a constant echo in his head that sounded like his own voice screaming backward. He was institutionalized 3 days later, muttering coordinates that led to a burnt-down house, a house that was never supposed to exist. Some survivors reported hearing a second heartbeat when standing alone. Others began leaving notes for themselves in their own handwriting, warning not to trust the reflection in the window. It wasn't what Cedar Ridge did to the land, it was what it unlocked in the mind. And once awakened, some echoes never quiet, they just change the way you hear silence. What if the town never wanted to be found? That's what Professor Elliott whispered before vanishing mid-lecture at the University of Michigan. His final slide showing a blurred image of Cedar Ridge's original map, with one word scribbled across it in red mimicry. Weeks later, his abandoned office was found covered wall to wall in mirrored newspaper clippings. Every article about Cedar Ridge rewritten with subtle changes, names spelled backward, dates distorted, faces almost but not quite familiar. The implications were bone deep. Whatever lived beneath Cedar Ridge didn't just haunt, it learned, it listened, imitated, copied emotion, memory, even grief. Survivors started receiving letters from their own childhood handwriting, describing events they never remembered living through. A woman from Asheville claimed her dead husband called her using a voice only slightly wrong. Not off enough to dismiss, just enough to undo her sleep forever. These weren't ghosts. They were echoes with agendas. Entities that fed not on fear, but on confusion. On reality unravelling one thread at a time. Cedar Ridge wasn't the end. It was a template. And something is still building from it. And then came the silence, not just quiet, but a deafening absence, as if Cedar Ridge had never existed. Google Earth blurred the coordinates. Historical records defaulted to null. Even state archives marked it as unverified. Families who lost loved ones could no longer prove they were ever born. Birth certificates faded. Grave markers turned to stone without names. One mother showed up to a reunion only to find her photo missing from every family album, her face replaced by a stranger's. Something was erasing the town, not just from maps, but from memory. The mimic hadn't just escaped, it had rewritten itself into neighbouring towns, local legends, even lullabies. A school in Kentucky banned a rhyme for being too close to one of the missing girl's diary entries. A broadcaster in Ohio died live on air, mid-sentence, right after whispering, "She's still humming. Authorities closed the case." But those who remember say Cedar Ridge never ended, it metastasized. And if you're watching this now, ask yourself, have you ever dreamed of a place you couldn't name, but knew you shouldn't return to? That's not your imagination. That's what's left of Cedar Ridge. If this story left you unsettled, that's exactly what it was meant to do, because some truths aren't meant to comfort, they're meant to confront. Cedar Ridge isn't just a place, it's a reminder that erasure can happen quietly, and horror doesn't always leave blood behind. Sometimes it leaves silence. If a part of you feels like you've been here before, maybe you have, in a dream you forgot, or a memory that never belonged to you. So ask yourself what else has been buried not by dirt, but by denial. If this story echoed something deep within you, don't let it fade. Drop a comment with the one detail that haunted you most. Save this video before it disappears from your algorithm, and hit subscribe so you never miss the stories they wish you'd forget. Because what's buried in the past isn't gone, it's just waiting for someone like you to remember.